I'm here in the October Gallery with the first exhibition in England of William Burroughs paintings and with Mr. Burroughs himself. And I wanted to start asking you about the paintings. Is this a recent development in your work, or have you done work like this simultaneously with your writing?
Well, I started doing montages with Brian Geisen. Brian Geisen in 1959 said that writing is 50 years behind painting, and he applied some of these techniques. We were using montages, making montages for scrapbooks since the very early 60s. So it's not a new development in that sense, but what you see here is a new development dating back to 1982.
Right. In a certain area of your work, especially in Nova Express and the Ticket That Exploded, you and some of the smaller works, you talked a lot about the methods of cut-up and the fold-in method and other methods. Is the montage that you're doing these pictures, does the procedure resemble some of the methods back in those days?
It does, very definitely, in that the cut-up introduced into writing a random factor, a cut of the scissors.
Right.
And here we have, in some cases, the blast of a shotgun producing an explosion of color, either hitting a tube of paint or a can of spray paint, which produces an explosion of color across the surface of quite unpredictable patterns. But this, of course, is not such a new thing in painting. It was done by Pollock, by Yves Klein, and I'm sure by others, letting paint drip down the canvas to form these random, unpredictable patterns. That doesn't rule out very careful brushwork. I think Pollock was a very careful artist, too. There's no contradiction there. You may simply use your drip canvas or your surface covered with color by a shotgun blast as a background for brushwork and silhouette work.
Do you feel, it's funny because that puts you in the abstract expressionist tradition, but do you feel that that's how you've worked on your books also? This combination of almost shotgun blast and very careful use of language?
Well, but there is no real equivalent for a shotgun
that's what I was
blast
asking,
on paper. There's no way you could do it. The cut-up method it introduces a random factor, but it isn't at all on the scale of an explosion.
Well, for you, is visual thinking different from verbal thinking?
Well, I don't think they're separable. It's like a film script. You have movement, and you have words. You have action, and you have words. And you are a writer, I think, is seeing a film. At least I'm seeing a film when I write, and then I try to get that film across to the reader to make him see what I'm seeing in the film.
Right. Well,
him or her.
Let me come back to this, but I want to start off with some of the early work. I want to ask you, everyone has written, and there's a lot of history in the libraries and whatnot about your connection with the Beats back in the early days. But how did you actually start writing, when and why?
I really started writing in, let's see, when was it? 51. My first book, Junkie, was written at that time. And that would be, I was in my 35 years old, very late for most people. Well, there had been some sporadic attempts before that. Kells Elvins and I wrote a short story together called Twilight's Last Gleamings, which has been one of my more popular numbers for readings. And that was in 1938. No one wanted to publish it. They even wrote us special letters of rejection.
why did you start writing?
Well, there's no reason why one starts writing. They asked Genet, when did he start writing? And he said, at birth.
Were you influenced by other writers?
Oh, well, heavens, yes, that's a very important part of the writer's input, is other writers. Conrad, very strong, Kafka, Graham Greene, of course, all the, Shakespeare, Rimbaud, Saint-Jean-Perse, Baudelaire.
So junkie and queer were fairly almost socio-realistic novels. They were written with a very linear sort of narrative.
Yes.
And there was a big change between them and Naked Lunch.
Yes.
First of all, what was the process of writing Junkie and Queer? Did you write those?
Well, it was pretty simple. Someone suggested that, Junkie was written first, that I should just write up my experiences with addiction. So I just sat down and reconstructed more or less in a straight journalistic style the experiences. There was a little moving around of one thing from here to here, but by and large, pretty much straight narrative. Queer was much less journalistic and more personal. But you see, there was a long gap between Queer, Junkie, Oh Yahé letters, of course. That was in 52.
Right.
But between that and the publication of Naked Lunch is, Naked Lunch was published in 1959 in Paris by the Olympia Press.
Right.
So that's a gap of more than 7 years.
It took a while for Naked Lunch to get published, though, didn't it?
Well, we had made several attempts. We'd had many rejections of the manuscript, but it really wasn't in a definite shape.
Right.
At that point. Now, Maurice Grotius of Olympia had turned it down when he first saw it about 2 years before 1959. And then there was an argument with the editors of the editors of the Chicago Review and the Board of Trustees, who didn't want them to publish Kerouac or Dahlberg or myself. So they resigned en masse and formed this magazine, Big Table.
Ah, that's one Big Table. Okay.
Yes. So when Maurice heard about this, he said, "Oh, it sounds like scandal," which he does.
Yeah.
And he sent someone over from the office, Sinclair Bayliss, in fact, came to my room and said that Maurice now wanted to publish this novel, Naked Lunch, and he needed the manuscript in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had a mass of notes, perhaps 1,000 pages of notes, some of it in pretty good shape, particularly, of course, the sections that appeared in Big Table were all ready to go.
Right.
So with the help of Brian Geisen, Allen, Sinclair, we got the manuscript ready in 2 weeks. And as we were completing a section, we'd send it to the printer, who didn't read English, incidentally. Made fewer mistakes in consequence. So we thought we'd, sort out the order later. But when it came back to the printer, we took one look and said, well, the present order is perfect. Yeah, the only one change was made was that what was the beginning then became the end. The two detectives walking in became the end of the book instead of the beginning. And that was the only change that was made in this more or less arbitrary order, not random, but arbitrary.
I wanted to ask you about your process of writing it. What I've heard, and I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, is I know that you have many files and collect information, that you had bits of information pasted up over the walls and you'd go from bit to bit. And that's apocryphal.
Yeah. You see,
How did you compose
in
it?
the first place, I wasn't into the cut-up method at that time at all.
Okay.
I knew nothing about that. And I was not paying any particular attention to newspaper articles and pictures. That came later, this interest in juxtapositions and newspaper and magazine articles, the collages. Well, no, I just wrote it in sort of short bursts of 3, 4, 5 pages as it came to me.
Now, between Naked Lunch and the Nova Express Ticket That Exploded period, what happened to the process of writing?
Well, principally the cut-up method,
Right.
which was Brian's idea, and I applied it with great enthusiasm, and I think in some cases carried it too far. Writers can get carried away by a technique and what they can do with this technique and carry it so far that they lose their readers. And I think this happened to some extent in those 3 books, The Ticket That Exploded, Nova Express, and The Soft Machine. Yes. There are many additions to The Soft Machine.
I have...
So that let's see, between the English and the American edition, I think there's about 30 or 40 extra pages in the complete edition, the British edition.
The British is complete. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh.
And when I told the Grove Press, who was about to reissue the book about this, they just weren't interested at all.
Really?
No.
Oh, I'll talk to
Well,
Fred
they
about
felt that, people were used to one version, and to say that this contains new material is not particularly an
that's quite
inducement.
wrong.
Well, that was their attitude anyway, so I just said, well, we'll forget it.
Are they reprinted yet?
Oh, yes, this was some time ago.
Oh, there's some time ago. Okay, that was when Grove was floundering. But, well, first of all, when did you meet Brian? And how did you meet Brian?
I met Brian in Tangiers in 1954. He was giving an exhibit of his paintings, the Rembrandt Hotel. And I went to the exhibit. We talked a while, but we were not all congenial at that time. He subsequently opened a restaurant called the 1001 Nights, and I used to eat there occasionally with, it was very good food, and he had dancing boys, and he got a lot of very chic clientele. But I didn't get to know him at all.
Right.
It was only later in Paris that I ran into him in 1958. And then he showed me his pictures, and I really began to see his pictures. Right. He taught me how to see a picture. Then we became very close friends.
When you started doing the cut-up method, were there any political... There's a lot of discussion in, say, Nova Express about the word as virus and the necessity to destroy the word. What were the, if any, the political ramifications? Or were there?
Well, there are no political ramifications that could be put into, fitted into any party.
Right.
There's no affiliations with socialism, communism, or certainly not, or capitalism. There are no direct political affiliations.
Well,
the whole thing is a mess. That's the point. In that way, political, yes.
Well, you talked about the word as a method of control, and that the cut-up of the word in some way would get rid of the control. Do you still feel that?
Well, it's not completely at all. I mean, it's just may loosen up this automatic association of word and what the word refers to. Well, you get these vague words like communism and capitalism. You have as many definitions as there are people who use them. There's total confusion. And that confusion is largely verbal. I studied with Korzybski, the founder of general semantics and anti-Aristotelian logic. And he says that one of the basic errors of Western thought is either or. Something is either instinctive or intellectual, either hereditary or environment. This split, which of course does not exist, in fact, it's both and.
I know that at least part of your writing has been involved with non-dualistic systems. When did you get involved with Scientology?
That was around 68, around in there. I just want to see what they had to say. Brian knew some of the early Scientologists, and he in fact had stayed with them in Algiers during the Civil War. So he told me about Scientology. He said they have this system they think will take over the planet. And he says it has a certain interest. So they say it works. He said, I wouldn't say that it works. I'd say that it does something. And that was my experience, yes. I went into it and became what they call a clear.
What's a clear?
Well, a clear is some of the, whose engrams have all been erased.
Right.
Engrams being words and images stored in periods of pain and pain and unconsciousness, like in an operation. He said no one should ever talk during an operation because the patient is hearing it. And a negative comment can have very devastating results. Well, this actually has been borne out, and they have, they're playing back tapes. They found that the person showed a great anxiety if there was something that keyed in. Right. Keyed in the operation, that is, even the sound of an instrument dropping or something of that sort, and words particularly. So they have in many hospitals an absolute rule: no talking, no joking in the operating room.
This is probably another apocryphal story. I had heard, I think Miles told me, that you once disguised yourself as a plumber, went into the Scientology offices and stole some files.
Absolutely, without the slightest foundation.
I've heard a lot of apocryphal stories. You've also been involved in some other methods of training. The one I know about is a bit with Trungpa Rinpoche.
Well, no, I was not involved with Buddhism.
Right.
I know a little bit about it, and Alan is very much into it, but it doesn't attract me too much. I've never really practiced meditation. I did take a course with the S people.
You did?
Yeah, but it was already a splinter group in London. I forget who, but it seems helpful. You get some interesting things from the...
From what, if any, other similar sources have you gotten information?
Well, those are the Scientology and S were the two, whatever you call them, systems that
systems, training schemes, I don't know.
Went into.
When did your interest in Egyptology start?
Years ago. I've always been interested in the idea of a pictorial language. I remember I took, and I was staying in Chicago, when I was living in Chicago in 1943 or 44, I started to take a course in Egyptian writing. And I did get some distance with it. I had Gardner's Egyptian grammar and wrote out these exercises. Very interesting, because it can be read immediately. It doesn't have the same linear quality. In the most recent book, The Western Lands, which I've only, I must say, partly read so far, in the middle of, it seems to me to be somewhat a meditation on death, based on a lot of the old Egyptian schemas. How helpful do you actually find that information? How what?
Helpful Do you actually find that? I mean, how seriously?
I think it's quite a helpful concept, the seven soul concept. Explains a lot. Of course, it's obvious that there's not much unity, but see, you have seven souls, and their interests at some point are irreconcilable. They do not have the same interests. This creates difficulties.
Would that be a sort of more complicated schema of when you talked a little about RM and about the centers that in which we oppose ourselves, we stop ourselves from, I'm not putting this very clearly, stop ourselves.
Well, yes, you would say that the existence of entities with divergent interests is going to make someone seem to be self-defeating in many instances.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get is there seems to have been a major change in your work between the Nova Express period and the later books, both stylistically and in terms of preoccupation. That in the Nova Express books you were being concerned with cut-up, you were also concerned with attacking various systems of control, both political in terms of the RM or whatever, the ways, and politically in terms of the use of word to control. And after that, say in The Wild Boys, and later on, the novels stylistically became more narrative, but more important for me, you seem to be concerned with how humans could get out of the predicament in which they were in. And at what caused that change in preoccupation, first of all?
Well, that would be too complicated even. You know, what causes a change in that sort usually does not have a definite answer. But given the change occurring, then the content will dictate a straight narrative.
Right.
If you're talking about pirates or guerrilla bands, you have to preserve a line of straight narrative in order to present your material.
Did you feel at all that the cut-up wasn't working? I mean, because obviously things change as environments change, and politically and historically, the United States and the Western world has changed greatly since '58 and the early '60s. Did you feel that the cut-up was no longer viable?
Not necessarily. It's a technique.
Right.
And like any technique, it works here and it doesn't work somewhere else, that's all. Like painting techniques.
When did you start thinking about the relationship of space to time?
Well, as soon as I thought about either one, because there's the obvious relationship, of course, how long does it take you to get from here to here?
Right. Who, at that point, when you were thinking in terms of space travel, whose work were your reference? What were your references in?
Well, from childhood, I used to read amazing stories, science fiction. I read Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells still stands up pretty good. I reread The Time Machine not long ago. Interesting.
What other writers do you read? I know you read a lot of science fiction.
Yes, quite a bit of science fiction. I read spy stuff, Le Carré, Forsyth, Len Deighton. I've read a lot of doctor books. It's a regular genre, as you know.
Yeah.
Very popular. The Making of a Surgeon and Dr. X. Started with Dr. X.
Yes, I know those.
So those are largely read for information. And I started out to be a doctor.
You did? I didn't know that. Was that what you studied at Harvard?
No. I started out in Vienna because they didn't require any pre-medical work.
Hmm.
Well, it's just as well it didn't work out. So medicine has always been one of my interests. hobbies, you might say.
Well, I remember seeing you on Saturday Night Live once. And very strong when you said, "I'm the doctor," and the TV camera came in on your face. But I keep trying to, sort of press over to this area, and I don't really know how to get to it. You obviously feel that things are in a bad way, politically, or in the world. I use the word politically very generally. I don't mean in terms of parties.
Disastrous way.
To what extent do you think it's possible for us to save ourselves?
An impossible question to answer. Who do you mean by us? And who do you mean by ourselves? I don't subscribe
Would that be an answer?
I don't subscribe to the idea that there's any such thing as human nature, humankind.
Right.
And I feel very little even empathy with most people. So when you speak of a we, it would be a pretty small we. Most we's you can include me out of. But Korzybski, it's one of the important things he points out, that not to use generalities, we, the American people, the consensus of informed opinion, oh wow. Well, someone says the consensus of informed opinion, you know you're going to hear some real nonsense.
And yet your books are all about survival.
Yes, of course they're about survival. Well, all right, there's one possibility would be escape from the planet for a few people.
Right. Do you think of this escape literally or in terms of altering perception?
Well, they're the same thing. If you alter your perception, then you have altered your location, your space-time location.
Are your books in any way methods for altering perception?
As far as they can be.
Yeah. How far do you think literature can work in that area?
Well, that's it, as far as it can go, in the same way with painting.
Do you think they work in the same ways?
Well, no, not quite.
It's a little what I was trying to get at, the difference.
Just not quite the same way, but Gerald Wilde said that any painting of consequence you can read. In other words, there's a story in it, not a message, but a story. And in the same way, writing, the more visual, the better, I feel. So they're both attempting the same thing.
Well, I guess one final question. Is The Western Lands your final book, or are you writing?
Oh, I'm working on another. I'm writing one about Jesus Christ now.
You are?
Yes, indeed.
Oh,
a lot of notes.
My mouth is open in astonishment. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I'm sorry we don't have time to get into Jesus.
I'd love to. Do we have time? I was signaled.
Well.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, to begin with, it's neither the rationalist approach. People are saying now that Jesus didn't exist. It was a whole retroactive construct of the church. I am convinced on aesthetic grounds that he did exist, because the whole gospel has the mark of one man talking, just as Shakespeare's plays do. Whoever wrote them, it was written by one person, Shakespeare. And I'm convinced personally that Shakespeare wrote them. And the same is true of Jesus. Now, did he perform any of these miracles? Undoubtedly, he performed some of them. But that is not so remarkable. Any good magic man can cure the sick sometimes. Can't win them all. And many of them can cast out devils, particularly if they installed the devils in the first place. And I've seen some very impressive weather magic. There's quite a few practitioners who can do weather magic. So he can do anything so terribly remarkable. But the church then set up this miracle monopoly, only by authorized personnel, by church personnel. So that was one result of Christ, this miracle monopoly. The Buddhists take a very, very dim view of miracles and healing. They say if you can, don't. First place, you're upsetting the natural order with incalculable long-range consequences. And two, that the healer is often motivated by the most deplorable self-glorification and vanity.
Do you think that was true of Christ?
Well, none comes to the Father except through me.
Yes. I see.
I think there's a degree of self-glorification involved.
Well, talking about morality, what do you think has happened? There seems to be a huge rise in institutionalized morality in the United States.
Well, symptom of fear, dislocation.
Right.
They don't know what's happening or where they are. And they want something they can hang on to, I suppose. But remember that there's a terrific gap between doctrine and practices built into the Christian religion.
Yes.
Love your enemies and all that, which is biologic suicide and put into practice. So no one puts it into practice or attempts to do so. So you have this gap between what people are supposed to do and what they actually do. Same, I think, is true of Mohammedanism. Less true of Buddhism than of any of the other major religions.
Well, Buddhism isn't theistic. It's not theistic. I mean, it's not about obeying one thing or one code.
Well, yes. Well, of course, then there are many schools of Buddhism.
Right. So, Jesus Christ, in a way, what's he like in the book? I mean, is he someone who is trying to control?
Well, I don't think that's exactly. He wouldn't put it that way. But he does say, none come to the Father except through me. In other words, he's the only one. Well, didn't Muhammad say the same thing? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, one and only. Well, in my story, the Christ virus gets loose from the Museum of Extinct Species. So you have hundreds of thousands and millions of people going around saying, I am the way, none comes to the Father except through me, and getting inherits and even performing miracles. After all, special effects have come a long way since Christ, so...
What about Judas in the book? How does he come in?
Who?
Judas.
Well, he hasn't come in yet. I haven't thought too much about it, but I'll get to him.
Sounds great. Oh, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Pleasure.
Yes.